Good afternoon, everybody. I make it approximately 2:59. We'll be beginning at 3 p.m. prompt. Please familiarise yourself with the handouts on the right-hand side of your screen. So you'll be able to see down the right-hand side underneath the handout section, our FFT report, the SAM Learning introductory brochure, as well as an introductory video. I will allow you some time at the end of today's presentation to download all of those resources. Okay, so I make it approximately 3 p.m, so I'm going to begin. So good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the latest SAM Learning webinar. Today, we're going to be looking into how you can successfully narrow and close student attainment gaps by using EdTech. First of all, I'm going to make some introductions. So my name is Stephanie King, and I am the Commercial Director here at SAM Learning. And I'm also joined by our Regional Director, Craig Hendelman, who, time permitting, will be taking questions at the end of today's forum. This is an open forum, so please do feel free to ask any questions that you may have. To do so, click on the orange arrow on the control bar, which is found on the right-hand side of your screen, and type your question into the questions box. So it looks like everybody has now arrived, so I'm going to begin. Okay, so it's a very strange time currently, isn't it? We now find ourselves on the run up to the summer holidays in a couple of weeks, while at the same time we're trying to figure out how our students have only managed to actually go to school for just over 3 months. Yet here we are, July in the new world, and as well as planning as usual for September onwards, we now have what seems like a gargantuan task of addressing an attainment gap that, due to the coronavirus outbreak, could widen by as much as 75% between disadvantaged children and their better off peers. In fact, a recent YouGov poll found 51% of teachers had pupils who were dropped out of education altogether during lockdown, while more than 70% said coronavirus would cause moderate or mild harm to their pupils' education. And it isn't just improving attainment levels that we will need to focus on come September. Javed Khan, the Chief Executive of the Barnardo's Children's Charity, said schools would face a huge spike in demand for support from hidden children who would become vulnerable as a result of the coronavirus crisis. This will most certainly have an additional impact. Currently, the attainment gap stands at 3.7 at Key Stage 4, according to DFE stats. If it were to widen by 75%, as suggested earlier, it would become 6.47, which would certainly appear to be almost catastrophic. But it is our belief that teachers cannot be made solely responsible for closing the attainment gap, and as a wider education community, we need to come together in resolving this as a team. But before we begin to tackle the challenge of the attainment gap, first we need to understand its scale and nature, as well as the factors most likely to close it. The EEF recently released a report showing that the gap in outcomes between those students from the more disadvantaged backgrounds and their classmates is already evident by the time they begin school, aged 5. Over the next 11 years of full-time education, it worsens. On average, there is a 4.3-month gap at the start of school between disadvantaged children and their classmates. This more than doubles to 9.5 months by the end of primary school, and then more than doubles again to 19.3 months by the end of secondary school. The latest official figures show the scale of the challenge, in particular for students from disadvantaged backgrounds. By age 19, over 164,000 students, 30% of the total cohort, had still not achieved a good standard of recognised qualifications in English and maths. Worryingly, this includes a majority, 50.2% of all students who had been eligible for free school meals. These qualifications are prerequisites for progressing into secure, good quality employment, including apprenticeships, as well as into further study, including higher education, and is the absolute staple of our company aim to be a launchpad to a successful career in life to all students, regardless of ability, disability, or disadvantage. It is also important to understand that the attainment gap is an issue nationally and not just in our deprived areas. In fact, outside of London, which has a current attainment gap percentage of 19%, the figures get progressively worse, with the southeast of England having an attainment gap percentage of 33.9%, meaning that barely 1/3 of FSM eligible pupils in the southeast achieved A to C grades in GCSE English and Maths. But the analysis of the attainment gap through the lens of geography can only take us so far. The reality is that within each area, there are schools where FSM eligible pupils are doing well and others where they are doing less well. This simple point highlights one of the main challenges in tackling the attainment gap, the big variation in the performance of similar schools with equivalent resources and intakes. Thankfully, in this war against attainment gaps, here in the UK at least, we are extremely well equipped as far as EdTech goes, and certainly up for the challenge. One of the strongest areas that EdTech has made an impact on is in the ease that we can now assess our pupils to first find where the gaps in knowledge are, and then to put interventions in place to narrow and eventually close them. As far as assessment goes, you have a number of options available to you. But when push comes to shove, if you choose to go down the route of EdTech in order to assess your students, then do be sure that it has the evidence behind it to back up any claim on its effect on student attainment, such as those shown in the impact report that you will find under the handout section in your control panel. So let's talk a little bit more about assessment and how SAM Learning in particular will level up any school's catch-up strategy. First and foremost, as mentioned earlier, SAM Learning is a proven system when it comes to improving attainment. For a number of years now, we have been the subject of numerous independent studies on the impact of e-learning and have proven to boost student attainment by 1 GCSE better in 2 subjects or 1 GCSE grade better in 3.5 subjects for your disadvantaged students. That equates to an equivalent progress aid gain of plus 0.2 or plus 0.35 for disadvantaged students. Secondly, it is important that your catch-up strategy doesn't just have GCSE Maths and English in mind. Ideally, gaps would be identified at Key Stage 2. However, with the absence of SATs data, we will need to start locating those gaps from scratch the moment school starts in September for your new Year 7 cohort, as well as your returning Year 8s, 9s, 10s, and 11s who will also need to be assessed, ideally including on those topics that were missed or taught remotely late in the year prior. And third, if you were able, you should now begin to identify gaps in knowledge in every subject, not just those that are considered core. And SAM Learning, as well as our fellow suppliers, are here to support you with what is a massive task that we are all faced with. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time on this webinar talking about how SAM Learning is well placed to take a huge weight off your shoulders with not only the identification of gaps in knowledge, but the subsequent filling in of those gaps, as it were. SAM Learning is pre-populated with over 100,000 curriculum map questions for all subjects in all key stages. As a company that has been around for over 2 decades now, we are extremely fortunate in that we've not only built a system that can be used at every moment throughout your pupil's learning journey, but also that we have built up a network of the very best educational authors to provide a content library of epic proportions that you, as a teacher, can be certain that no matter which stage of secondary education your learners are in, there will be content on SAM Learning ready and waiting for them to use. And that is hugely important here because the schools that we speak to that are confident in their ability to close the gap in September inform us that SAM Learning will play a massive part in their strategy by using one of our many activities to assess exactly where the gaps in knowledge are throughout a breadth of subjects, keeping that data all in one place rather than having different subjects assessed in a variety of different ways. Imagine being able to set some catch-up work on SAM Learning, knowing that as and when you return to school, You will be able to see a clear and concise report on each student's comprehension in every subject, helping to inform you where gaps are and what students will need the most resource moving forward. Or setting a term's worth of revision at the beginning of the year, like some of the staff at George Pinder School do. SAM Learning includes a standard access to its three-wave intervention model. We don't believe in selling add-ons. So the one price that you pay for SAM Learning includes absolutely everything for your school stage, including access to our three-wave intervention model so that you can create a number of different intervention groups, such as subject-specific catch-up groups, pupil premium, SEN, and so on, and then set differentiated tasks at a group or individual level based on the identified gaps that SAM Learning has highlighted. So for example, a Year 7 class teacher can set a non-threatening baseline assessment of their new intake, create subgroups that will never be visible to a student based on their comprehension levels, and then set work specially curated for them to catch up. Catch up is not just about the work you do in school. It is no huge surprise to hear that in disadvantaged areas, especially, even accessibility to the internet can be an issue. Not every child has access to a computer at home, but they may have access to a mobile phone. That is why, as part of SAM Learning's promise to help students catch up, we have made all of our content mobile enabled so that if any of your pupils want to learn independently, they can do so with no technical hurdles. After all, the more work that they do independently, the more data you will have at your fingertips to form successful interventions. Now, I could spend all day here on this webinar talking to you about the merits of e-learning when it comes to closing the gap. However, the most powerful and helpful words that you will hear today on the impact of SAM Learning won't come from myself or Craig. They will come direct from the mouth of a teacher who is in exactly the same position as all of you, facing the challenge posed by closing the gap. Today, it is my pleasure to introduce you to David Brown. He's a former head of science and assistant head teacher who now works closely with a number of schools in the UK, guiding them to successfully close the gap via the use of e-learning. David, you have a huge amount of experience working in education. What is your view from the ground when it comes to closing the gap? I'm now going to hand over the presentation to David, who will give you an overview on his view on this.
Thank you, Stephanie. I'm just switching over to my screen. Can you see the presentation now?
Yes, I can see it nice and clearly.
Lovely, thank you. I'll carry on from there then. Hello, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. So I'm going to talk for less than 10 minutes about my experience in using SAM Learning across several different schools that I worked in my teaching career at different levels. I will start with, there we go, talking about as a classroom teacher. I had 26 years in the classroom. I would use e-learning, particularly SAM Learning, in 3 out of 4 of my schools to set regular homeworks. Partly that was a great thing because it gave me high quality resources to set the pupils, but of course it also gave me something that was automatically marked and allowed me to prioritise my time elsewhere regularly. It would have good quality revision resources as we were running up to the exams, and I always found that if I'd set pupils regular homework revising online, that when it came to their exams, they would use SAM Learning, for instance, to revise for all of their other subjects too. So it had some feedback across the whole curriculum, some positive gains there. I'd quite often encourage my pupils to use the online activities for diagnostically. How do they know what to revise well? I would always advise them, have a quick go at a 10-minute SAM Learning activity, see how well you do with it. If you're doing great on it, don't prioritise that for revision. If you find yourself stumbling, now you know what you need to look at. I'd quite often use it in flipped learning in classes. When I was about to hit a new topic, I would say to the class, have a go at this activity. And then when they'll come to the class, I'd go, right, what did you find easy? What did you find difficult? Let's focus in on the issues. As I was teaching, I was always looking for these gaps, looking for these performance gaps, whether they were to do with disadvantaged and non-disadvantaged, or gender, or related to ethnicity. And I always used to find that, in particular, SAM Learning was great for filtering down the reports. You could look at any achievement report and filter it a number of ways. I could look at my boys' performance. I could look at my boys' pupil premium performance, and I could see not just how much work these people were doing online, but how well they were doing. And that enabled me straight away to put in support. I could either sit them down and say, let me help you to log in, let me show you how you can do these things, or I could target work specifically at them according to what I diagnosed as their need. Whenever I used to have an end of topic test, following straight on from that, I would make a little subgroup, a wave one group as we call it nowadays, of those pupils who'd underperformed, and set them a little bit of extra targeted work for the next 2 or 3 weeks to help them to catch up. When I had pupils that were missing lessons regularly, whether they were doing, for instance, a Wednesday afternoon course at a local garage on their vocational course, or just missing a lesson every week because they had a music lesson, I knew I could target them extra work to help them to catch up. As a head of science, I carried on doing that as a teacher, but my job obviously was to support my colleagues who work with me. So we used to link the activities from SAM Learning in through our schemes of work into our topic maps. So we knew exactly which activities the pupils were would be best advised to carry out, for instance, when they're revising for a test for their end of year exams. We had a homework policy of setting online tasks every other week, interleaved with regular kind of handwriting tasks, and that would help my staff to balance their marking load, confident that they're setting good quality resources. We shared, of course, our revision packages, our list of activities that people should be doing as they run up to their exams. Those were shared across the department. We could target them also to groups of higher ability and to foundation students. Part of what we did was have our weekly science department detentions. We moved them from a lab into a computer room so that we could actually focus the pupils' time there on constructively working on SAM Learning on topics that they were either doing at the moment or they'd missed recently. And part of the great thing about it is we could always review how well they were doing. You can get on there and you can see how many hours worth of work they've done and how well they've done on it. And you can filter it all sorts of different ways. You can get a view across a cohort, you can get a view in a class or a subgroup, or by a pupil characteristic. So in my science department, we would always have these underachievers that we would identify through science department meetings. We'd make a little group of those and we'd track what they were doing. If they were underperforming, we'd call them in for a little bit of extra work. We'd target the 4-5 borderline. That was always great because there are always some pupils who were thinking, right, I want to go for the higher paper. I'm going to work for it, I promise I am. And we could say, well, prove it. Let me see that you're doing some SAM Learning work each week to show that you're working on the gaps in your knowledge. That was always very useful. And then, of course, as a head of science, I had to report back to my senior team. And it was so easy to say, these are our focus groups. This is where we're intervening. This is the impact of those. Look, back then, we had this percentage achievement from these pupils. Now on our target group, we've improved to this. And it was very, very easy to see and open the sorts of discussions that you need in terms of next steps. So as an assistant head teacher, where I was in charge of curriculum and timetable, it was natural that I led on e-learning as well. So I was looking for two things for e-learning. I needed to provide the content, and I needed something that would be good for reviewing, revising, and assessing. So we use Moodle for our main content platform, just because of the flexibility that we had then to organize it exactly as we like. We could put our regular resources on, we could access it from classrooms as we liked, and so on. And then we had SAM Learning because there were solid pre-prepared resources that would feed back, and we could do the sorts of analysis that I mentioned a minute ago. Of course, I worked with the departments that I line managed to help them to manage their own work-life balance. When you're working hard and running a department, you need ways to save some time sometimes without sacrificing quality. So I'd always encourage them to follow my lead in terms of a regular program of setting online work for them. What we also did was we had an internal exclusion unit, and so the pupils that couldn't behave well in mainstream lessons or having some trouble and needed to be out for a day, we knew that we could put them in our unit. They would have access to computers, and the great thing was teachers could within 5 minutes set them some work on Sam Learning that they could do while they were out in that other room. Much easier, we found, than having to go and find a book and then get down to the photocopier and choose the right pages and then send that over to where the pupil was. It was very quick to just log in and set them some work. So we found that very useful. What else did I do as an assistant head teacher? Well, worked quite a lot with the SEND department, and what the SENCO there did was they created groups within each year. So they had their year 7 SEND pupils, their year 8 SEND pupils, and a lot of the time they used it for monitoring. They could log in and they could very quickly see a live report of how much work these pupils were doing. So they could praise appropriately, or they could support where they needed to. They could set the intervention tasks. For instance, those pupils who underperformed in their SATs, they could target at activities based on literacy or numeracy. We became a Pixel school, and of course, those of you involved in Pixel know that one of the things you do is you find your borderline groups in year 10 and 11, and you can focus in on those. And one of the great things was we could make these groups of pupils in Sam Learning as a senior team, and then share those with the subject leaders and the teachers and say, these are the target students. You can look and see what they're doing in your subject right now, how well they're doing, how much they're doing, and you know which of these pupils from this group you need to target within your subject area. We found that very useful. Just looking at this last point, yes, in terms of disadvantaged and pupil premium, obviously we could focus on those. We had our wave 2 groups defined for those. We could review how well they were doing, and of course what we could do then is prove the benefit of allocating them Sam Learning tasks. We can actually use some of the pupil premium money a little bit towards the Sam Learning subscription, and of course some towards laptops and tablets, which will enable them to do their e-learning, and so that kind of fed itself in terms of benefits. So after 26 years of teaching, I thought I'd try something different, and I moved over to Sam Learning. And I think I've been thinking a lot as I've been talking to teachers like yourselves in schools the last term about what I would be doing next term as I'm coming back to school in September. I'd definitely still be using Sam Learning work regularly, partly because I know that I would have to be spending more time analysing the gaps of my pupils and targeting work for catch-up, because I know that some of my pupils would absolutely be fine and would have done virtually everything I've asked them for, and I wouldn't even noticed I hadn't been there for the last 6 months, and there would be ones that I really need to focus in on. So I'd be making my subgroups, my group 1, wave 1 groups, and of pupils that hadn't done what they needed to during lockdown, I would be focusing work to them. Some automatically marked tasks would free my time then so that I could do my catch-up planning, and I know that I get emailed the results that I could carry on into my class with. As a subject leader, I would be supporting my department still with specific lists of topics. These are the ones that cover the work that they should have been doing last term when they were at home. Let's use some of these to diagnose. Let's find the gaps in their knowledge. Let's find the gaps in performance, and that way we know exactly where to target our interventions. I'd be asking each of my teachers to make sure that within their teaching classes, they had these intervention groups created so that they could monitor them first and also then set the work to them as they needed to. As a senior leader, same basic ideas really: find the gap, monitor them, target them. And of course, one of the great things I think about Sam Learning is the leaderboard. You can see which of your pupils are doing well. You can set them targets. You can have competitions. You can reward a tutor group or an individual. Tin of sweets at the end of term for a tutor group is always a great prize to work for. Similarly, a box of sweets or a bottle of wine for the member of staff who sets the most tasks for pupils across the term, or has the best use of groups to support their intervention. Nice little motivator in the staff room. I want to finish now by talking to you about a couple of examples that schools have shared with me in the last few months about how they're looking at SAM learning and its impact on their pupils. There's two quick examples I want to share with you. This school, after last year's GCSE results, looked at the Progress 8 scores of their pupils. They did all pupils and they did pupil premium. I'm just focusing on pupil premiums here. They took the average Progress 8 score of the pupils who had done less than 1 hour's worth of SAM learning across the year, and they used that as a baseline and then calculated from there the benefits of using SAM learning for different amounts. And you can see from this table, it's a pretty good picture. You'll notice immediately on the EBAC column in the middle there, there's a bit of red and orange. Well, we dug into that and we found that history and geography teachers hadn't been setting SAM learning work barely at all. And we weren't surprised that maths had the best because we could see evidence that they'd been setting lots across the year. All of the research studies we've done do show that once pupils get above 10 hours across a year, you really do start to see positive benefits from using SAM learning. We're not surprised then that row and above gives us about a 0.35 positive, but it was nice to see that in an actual set of data coming from a school with 60 pupil premiums there. The second analysis I'll share with you briefly. This is just part of this. This school did a great analysis after their mocks and compared their Progress 8 scores that they calculated in school from their mocks with forecast Progress 8. And so on the graph, you can see above or below the line to see where they were relative to what they were hoping for in the summer. But what they also did then was they correlated that against the amount of time that those pupils had spent on SAM learning. And what they found was for every analysis they did, whichever subject or whichever EBAC area they were looking at, the pupils that did more SAM learning got better Progress 8 gains. This example here that I've got for this subject's mock results, you can see that those with a positive Progress 8 had 70% average on SAM learning, whereas the ones with the negative only had 51. So, you know, positive gains there. They found this consistently across. And as I've highlighted on the right-hand side, so where SAM learning has been used effectively, where students are revisiting their learning to achieve 80% or better in their activities, their index scores are better and student outcomes have improved. So it's nice to see that. And as I say, this did happen fairly consistently across their curriculum, except for the subject areas that weren't using it, when they found obviously very little effect. So I was really pleased to be included in these analyses from school. So and I would ask you, please, if your school does this sort of analysis after your results, please do share that with us. If you've got staff who are interested in carrying out this sort of analysis, get them in touch with us, with your school success manager. We're very happy to work with you to see what we can pull from your data. So that's the end of what I've got to say. If you've got any questions, please do put them in to the chat and Craig will answer them at the end. I'm going to hand you back to Steph. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And for anyone that would like to get in touch with our guest speaker directly, please either let us know in the chat or you can email me after today's webinar and I'll gladly put you in touch with David. I'm sure everybody found that very useful. It was certainly an interesting insight into what SAM learning can do for you at this time. At this time, I would also like to take the opportunity to introduce you to our latest short video, welcoming you to SAM learning, that you will find on the handout section on the control panel to the right-hand side of your screen. So please do take 5 minutes after the webinar, should you wish to learn a little more about SAM learning's award-winning content. And you'll also find there our latest brochure and the FFT impact report, which demonstrates the positive impact SAM learning can have on your student outcomes, and in particular those students who are from disadvantaged backgrounds. Okay, so as promised, we are now going to be holding our Q&A session around the questions that you have asked throughout the webinar today. We'll also be more than happy to arrange a free of charge virtual demonstration specific to your school at a later date, either with myself or Craig, So if you do want to take advantage of that, feel free to get in touch via phone or email on the details I'll be providing shortly and in your webinar pack. Okay, so over to you, Craig. How's the question panel looking this afternoon?
Thanks, Steph. Yeah, the questions have been coming in steadily over the course of the webinar, so I'll aim to answer as many as I can in a limited time frame. We appreciate you're all busy, so we try to keep our webinars between sort of half an hour and 40 minutes. So if I don't get around to your question live on this webinar, then either myself or Stephanie will absolutely be in touch shortly after the webinar ends. Okay, so the first question that we received was from Andy, who said that we plan on using CATS tests for our new Year 7 students in September. What will SAM Learning do for us in identifying gaps that those tests won't? Well, firstly, hello, Andy. Thank you for being with us here today. And thank you for your question. So firstly, Andy, I wanted to say that you're absolutely doing the right thing in using CATS tests in September. And they'll do what they do best, and they'll give you your predicted student levels. But what it won't do is take into account that in the 6 months prior, your pupils are likely to have gone through quite a significant disruption to their learning and subsequently might not be in the best position academically to take any sort of formal assessment. What SAM Learning will do in this case is provide something that's super important here, and that's a non-threatening form of assessment that they're going to be comfortable with, and that will most likely give you a better indication of ability. At the same time, introducing your new Year 7 students to SAM Learning at that early stage is going to set what can be a significant part of their learning journey throughout secondary school years, which is what you want as teachers, because the more engaged a student, the more data you're going to receive, and the more data you have, the more informed judgments you can make. Additionally, having that huge library of cross-curricular content ready and waiting to go means that you can explore a much wider spectrum of subjects and find not only the gaps in subject knowledge, but also subjects where that particular student excels. All the while, of course, you're going to get this data without having the hassle to mark these assessments, as SAM Learning is going to do that for you, freeing up your time to do exactly what you do best. Thank you, Andy, and I hope that answers your question. Okay, let's go for one more question, and that question comes from Susan. Now, Susan has asked if we can go a little bit more detail about the evidence behind our claims to improve student attainment. And Susan, firstly, I really thank you for asking this question, because you've reminded me that I need to bring up a very important piece of news for you all. So the Education Endowment Foundation, who are the leading UK body responsible for saying what works to improve learning outcomes, they commissioned a report recently, so June 2020, and the new reports show clear evidence of strong and much more significant positive outcomes for disadvantaged pupils should they put in a total 10 hours of online learning per year, resulting in GCSE grade improvements of between 1/5 and half a grade improvement per subject. But that those free school meal pupils were less likely to do the 10 hours needed to secure these gains. And we really wanted to discuss this in much greater depth. So to do that, we're going to be holding a virtual event on the 21st of July, chaired by our chairman, David Jaffa, who's also going to invite speakers that include David Johnston, the Education Select Committee member and former CEO of the Social Mobility Foundation, Naomi Eisenstadt, the inaugural director of the DFE Sure Start Unit, and independent advisor to the First Minister of Scotland, John Murphy, the CEO of Oasis Learning Community, and also Virendra Sharma, MP. I'm sure that this event is going to result in a really compelling discussion on what needs to be done to realise these gains for disadvantaged pupils, and you are all absolutely welcome to join the discussion and the event. And what we'll do is that we'll send you all a sign-up link shortly after the webinar. Okay, definitely looking at time, I'm going to hand the mic back to Stephanie. But again, if your question wasn't answered here today, we will be in touch shortly after the webinar ends. Thank you, Steph. Over to you.
Thank you, Craig. And that, I believe, brings us to the end of today's webinar. I do hope that you've enjoyed it as much as we have presenting it. And I'm now going to leave you to watch our video, and you can download our brochures, which we have provided, as I said earlier, in the handout section of your control panel on the right-hand side of the screen. We would like to take this opportunity to wish you all the very best in these very strange times. So from myself, Craig and David, goodbye, and hopefully we'll hear from you again soon. Thank you.